Welcome everyone to the Wheeler Centre for this conversation with David Marr, my colleague who I've known for many years, and it's a delight to be able to ask him some questions tonight on his wonderful quarterly essay, The Prince, on George Pell. We all know that George Pell has been in the headlines of late. It's not easy to try to encapsulate the life and essence of such a powerful figure, but I think David has absolutely done that in this marvellous quarterly essay. What I would like to know is what drove you to write it in the first place?
Oh, I've been writing about Pell for years. I was present when he delivered the inaugural Acton lecture on religion and liberty. That was a big event. I was there the night he was installed as Archbishop of Sydney. He'd first gone to pray at the shrine of Mary MacKillop and then, in a stretch Ford limousine, proceeded across the bridge and was unloaded in the forecourt of St Mary's Cathedral in Sydney, where there were a large number of demonstrators, at the time, mainly sort of rainbow sash demonstrators, and he blessed them all, wished everybody in the forecourt well, and walked into the cathedral to a blaze of trumpets. And I thought, that's my man. And then a little further down the track, when I became determined to find a way of writing an account of the child abuse crisis in Australia, I thought that a way of cutting a path through the immense forest of this subject would be to see how the man who had become the leading Catholic in Australia had dealt with the leading crisis in the church, and to put them together in an essay.
And how do you think he's dealt with it?
Not as well as he should have. He has dealt with it very poorly in some respects. As a young priest in Ballarat, he was blind to what was going on around him. And Ballarat, in the 1970s, when he returned from Rome and Oxford, was one of the unsafest places for a Catholic child to grow up, particularly if they were unfortunate enough to be at the Christian Brothers Primary School of St Alepius, next door to where Pell was living. And he was blind to what was going on in Ballarat. He admits this himself. He talks about being wet behind the ears. There was, however, a moment when at least the career of at least one pedophile could have been cut short, and that was when a young boy from St Pat's in Ballarat, Tim Green, has never put his name to this before this essay, and Tim and a few of his mates were changing to have a swim in the Eureka Stockade swimming pool, and by chance Pell, who's a swimmer, was changing as well. And Tim was 12, and to this day he does not know where he found the courage to say, "Father, you have to do something about Brother Dowland at St Pat's, he's abusing the kids." Pell has no memory of this conversation. Green remembers Pell saying something like, "Don't be ridiculous," and walking out to the swimming pool. Dowland went on to have 20 more years of abusing children. He was eventually sent to jail after the Christian Brothers spent about $2 million defending him at a series of trials. And I've no doubt that Pell regrets not cutting that career short as well at that point. Then he became auxiliary bishop in Melbourne, and he had different problems. Then he became archbishop, and he put into place the Melbourne response, the one absolutely surefire outcome of which is that it's probably saved the Catholic Church about $200 million in compensation claims in Melbourne alone.
And to explain that, I think we should make clear perhaps that the limit of payments originally was $50,000, later lifted to $75,000, I think.
The Melbourne response in the years since it was operating, it began to operate essentially in early 1997, and gave some figures to the parliamentary inquiry that it had settled the claims of 300 people 300 people abused in the Archdiocese of Melbourne alone, and only by priests, not by religious. These are not, the Melbourne response only covers the parishes, not the schools. 300, and they've been paid an average of $32,500 each. One of those victims gave evidence to the inquiry that he had been raped 10 times as a 9-year-old. He was paid about $22,000. And the lawyers who work in this field, seeing what they can do for victims not just of the abuse of Catholic priests, but Anglican priests and Salvation Army, and say that if you could sue the Catholic Church, which you can't, if you could sue the Catholic Church, you'd get about 10 times what's offered by the Melbourne response.
By and large, many Catholics, though, in Victoria seem to go with the Melbourne response rather than try and follow the path of any legal proceedings outside the church, with the exception of the Fosters, who had their own experience with George Pell, that they tell in graphic detail, and he seems to say that he can't recall key parts of that. Is there a pattern here?
Look, on the business of going with the Melbourne response, can I just fill in a little bit of the story, simply on the grounds that I'm fascinated by it? There was a change in the culture of the police in Victoria that is crucial to this story, because this is a story really about the collusion between the church and the state, between the church and the priests, and between the church and politicians. But in the 1980s, the fundamental impulse of the Victorian police to protect priests began to change, and they became interested in the accusations that were beginning to emerge of abuse by priests. And one of the first people they got was Father Gerard Ridsdale, who had briefly shared the presbytery at St Alipius with Pell. And Pell walked Ridsdale to court in 1993, when he was going to court, to plead guilty to about 25 charges of molesting children. Now, Pell makes much of the fact that he did not give evidence for Ridsdale. He was a bishop. He walked in with a priest about to plead guilty. You're a magistrate sitting up there on the bench, and the accused comes in with a bishop on his arm. You think better of him. And Ridsdale got a tiny little sentence. Now, that tiny little sentence was like a bomb going off in the victim community in Melbourne. It enraged victims. Firstly, that Pell had gone there. The press didn't notice this, by the way. It's very interesting. This is one of these stories the press just didn't notice for years, but amongst victims, they were absolutely furious. And one of the things they did was to start to sue, to start to try to sue. And they discovered the brick walls, the deep pits, the barbed wire entanglements, the spikes, the broken glass that defend the Catholic Church from civil suits. And they were compelled to settle. When the Melbourne response was set up, the Melbourne response works because it is essentially impossible to sue. But the Fosters sued. Now, the Fosters, Chrissy and Anthony Foster, 2 of their daughters were raped by Father Kevin O'Donnell of Oakley. Now, Father Kevin O'Donnell was known to be a child molester to the church. He had been known to be a child molester for something like 30 or 40 years. He was moved on from time to time. He was always protected. Father O'Donnell had a happy knack of making the church a lot of money with real estate purchases. He just was very clever at real estate. And the Fosters' children, 2 little girls, were raped. Shortly after Pell became Archbishop of Melbourne, there was briefly a really wonderful thing happening in Melbourne. There was an outreach service that was run by Gerald Cudmore, who was the Vicar General, and Helen Last, who was associated with him. And they were going out to parishes that had pedophile priests there, looking for victims, looking to help victims, trying to heal the parish. And Pell, before he entered this system, went out to the parish of Oakley, and there he met the Fosters.
And other parents.
And firstly the Fosters, just the 3 of them in a crowded room in the presbytery. And that was a very uncomfortable exchange. And then Pell met the parish, and that was a stupendously uncomfortable meeting. But luckily, some of the parents got together that night and produced an 18-page transcript of that meeting, which I was able to draw on for the essay. The Fosters were offered $50,000 by the Melbourne Response for the rape of their two daughters, and they decided to fight. They fought for 9 years, and finally they were offered about $750,000 and they settled. But that was after 9 years. The church even denied any knowledge that O'Donnell might have been a pedophile, even though by this time the Melbourne Response was paying out sums of money to O'Donnell's other victims. They compelled the Fosters to prove that O'Donnell was a pedophile, even though they had been apologised to by Pell for O'Donnell's abuse of their daughters. I mean, every trick in the book. And in the end, the Fosters settled. There has been no case in Australia against the Catholic Church for child abuse that has actually reached a verdict in court.
Now, when this all came up, when this all came up at the Victorian inquiry that was set up largely as a result of what was going on in Ballarat,
the suicides of pupils at St Olympia's Primary was one of the principal drivers for Baillieu to set up the inquiry, yes.
That's right. And George Pell found himself in the hot seat.
Wasn't that an afternoon, Heather?
It was. You were there and I was there. I would like you to talk about your impression of how he appeared to feel just astounded that he was in this position.
Well, he'd never been questioned like this in his entire life. And it was a skilled interrogation. I had seen those parliamentarians questioning people earlier, and I thought it was a bit shaky. But Pell was the second last cab on the rank, and they were practised, and they knew what to ask him. And the angriest member of Parliament was the Christian Brothers educated barrister, O'Brien. He was the angriest. Pell never lost his temper, but as I observed in a piece I wrote for The Guardian, his colour rose all afternoon. He has this thing, this presence of... He does this thing of the great, which is to kind of stare into the far distance. He never seems to quite focus. I suggested he was kind of focusing on Macquarie Island. There was this hugely distant stare. His answers were a mixture of frank admission of the church's faults, which he gets. He knows the church, and he says the church had done badly. A frank admission that he knows lives were wrecked. But it seemed to me that his deepest impulse was to protect the institution to which he's devoted his life. I think Pell reckons that you just get through this rough patch, and the aim is to get through with as many of the privileges and as much of the assets of the church as possible, and then you steam on unchanged into the future. That was the impression I got from that afternoon. And those hours are the backbone of this essay. What I learnt that afternoon is the backbone of this essay, and my sense of his character was not entirely formed that afternoon, but it was an eye-opener. He got through it without losing his temper, and you could see that every moment of it kind of outraged him.
It was very telling. In your research over his life, apart from what we saw that day, what is your sense of the essence of the man and what his particular brand of Catholicism is?
Heather, the brand of Catholicism I think is much easier to talk about than the essence of the man. You've got to remember, he grew up in Ballarat when Catholicism worked. It really worked. You know, Catholicism in Ballarat was taking an intelligent, hard-working community. It was educating the kids. It was putting them into the professions. They weren't deserting Ballarat. They were coming back to Ballarat. the Catholic community in Ballarat was becoming middle class, well educated, powerful, knew what it was doing, and proud of itself. It worked. It was Catholicism working, and it was a Catholicism, of course, of the rules. It was very, very Irish. It was unquestioning. It was a Catholicism of great respect for priests, great respect for priests. And the church that Pell went into at the end of his time at St. Pat's was a church at the absolute high tide of its power, of its reach. Werribee, the seminary, when he went there, the great old house at Werribee, was bursting at the seams. They'd had to open an annex down in town. It was full. And Pell went into a glorious, confident church. And he spent his whole life watching the tide go out, really. But he was also driven, of course, by having been swept away by Bob Santamaria during the split. He went to a meeting, he talks about this, he went to a meeting when he was 14 in Ballarat, Bob Santamaria, and he was swept away by the heroic mission that Santamaria offered young men in particular, either in the church or in politics, to fight the evil that was encircling civilization, the evil then of communism. It morphed, of course. It turned into a number of other things. It's now secularism, by the way, in case you're curious. And the secular agenda. I'm not quite sure what's on the secular agenda, but I understand it's particularly evil. And I think I might in some way embody some of the secular agenda. That was him. But now the person, I'm not pretending to have an intimate knowledge of Pell. I can only talk about him from reading hundreds of thousands of his words, of looking at him in action, of thinking about him, of talking to people who know him. But my sense is that there's not much there. And I talk at the end of the essay, and this man is an intelligent man. He's led a fascinating life. He has made himself the most prominent churchman in this country. He is an astonishingly astute lobbyist. People may not be going to Mass anymore, but the Catholic Church has never educated so many children. It's never looked after so many sick. It is bigger. It is better funded. It is more politically embedded in this country than it has ever been, and a good deal of that is due to Pell. He's a man of standing in Rome. He has a whole other existence in Rome as a Catholic potentate with reach across the world. He has had this fascinating life. And I talk at the end of the essay about the strange ordinariness of this man. There's just nothing particularly personal there. There's a great man. This is partly why I call the essay The Prince. There is this great man, this big man, this huge presence, but it's so impersonal. It's just kind of blank.
That's certainly what comes through from some of the victims who had their conversation, what they reported, their conversations with him. But do you think the fact that he does come across as such a powerful figure, and is indeed a powerful figure, is that what stopped governments for so many years doing anything? We've got inquiries now, but they haven't been until now. Is that what stopped that from happening?
Partly. I mean, one of the things I chart in the essay are the years and years and years that Pell opposed any call for any royal commission into what was happening inside the Catholic Church. For me, I have to say, I hadn't really realised this until I wrote the essay, and I came away from the essay with one fundamental conclusion. This institution has never wanted to know how bad it was, or indeed might be. The Church has never conducted a systematic investigation to find out what has been going on in its own ranks. Never. And it has, and still has no wish to do so. You may have seen in the press this morning reports of a submission that Truth, Justice and Healing has put to the Royal Commission, which is essentially, this is what we intend to do to fix things up. It does not include investigating. It still doesn't include investigating. Raises the issue of, can you really apologise for something which you have taken steps not to know about? But anyway, this this kind of unwillingness to know is one of the absolutely crucial things about this story. And for Pell, it's been a willingness to deal with victims as they put up their hands, but not to really get out there and know. And you were asking me a question which has gone a little bit off to one side.
I'm not surprised. My point was...
my anger about the failure to investigate is just volcanic, really. You're seeing me calm about it. How can you not want to know? Sorry. Heather.
My point was, and that was very important what you had to say, but I guess I'm wondering why governments took so long to do anything about this. Was George Pell's power partly what stopped them? When victims were starting to come forward, not in huge numbers, but we were starting to hear about them,
yep.
But still governments did nothing.
All through Howard's time, there were repeated calls for a royal commission, and Howard always said no. Pell always said no, Howard always said no. When the Irish reports came down, those staggering reports of what happened in Ireland, which I think are very important in the whole shift of public opinion in Australia, because Ireland kind of is Australia in a way, isn't it, really? And certainly the Irish Church and the Australian Church. I mean, how can you distinguish the two? Those reports were staggering, and Pell was there immediately saying, yes, but Australia's not Ireland. Don't do it, don't do it, don't have a royal commission, don't do it. And governments listened to him. Now, Gillard didn't, we'll get to that in a minute. I've written, for 20-something years, I've been fascinated by religion and politics, and what is it that makes politicians in particular, what makes politicians willing to honour the wishes of some of the least popular religious leaders in the country? And Pell's view of how Catholics should lead their lives and how Australians should lead their lives are strongly held minority views. Mainstream Catholicism is not Pell-style Catholicism. And yet, governments have honoured what figures like Pell have wanted to do, like Brigadier Jim Wallace, retired of the Australian Christian lobby, his values, and it's truly horrible. And yet governments have listened to him, governments gone. And when the Royal Commission was finally called, John Sturton, who runs Nielsen polling, just off his own bat, put at the bottom of his fortnightly polling he did for Fairfax about, who's your preferred Prime Minister, what do you think of the Royal Commission? 95% support for the calling of the Royal Commission. He's never seen any result like that in all of his time as a pollster. This would indicate that there was very, very strong public support for an inquiry into what the churches were up to for a long time. The politicians weren't listening to that. The politicians were listening to the religious leaders who were saying, no, 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 no. This is my theory. My theory is politicians in this country are really scared of the mayhem that religious leaders can cause if they kick up a fuss. It's the fuss. And because we so rarely have to confront issues of religious liberty in this country, it is very easy for religious leaders to misrepresent their defence of privilege as a fight for religious freedom. And politicians are just dead scared of it. So last year, and there's no support for this kind of thing inside the Catholic Church, or indeed inside other churches, except for some fringe loonies. Last year, at the request of religious leaders, the Gillard government, or it might have been even earlier this year, put into law the right of church employers, when using public money to conduct public functions like education, health, etc., the right not to employ people like me, poofters, lesbians, transsexuals, remarried divorcees, with public money. Now, that's not on in Britain, that's not on anywhere in Europe, but we do it in Australia, and there's no public call for it. But it's the fear of the mayhem that might be caused if you just said no.
So the politicians are not necessarily in step with the community.
No.
Which happens in other areas as well, I guess, doesn't it?
It's not the only area. No. They're scared. They're scared of religious leaders.
So if we go back to George Pell, as these allegations towards priests were starting to surface more and more, we were starting to hear a lot more cases of paedophilia. George Pell wasn't able to escape certain allegations being directed towards him as well. Are we able to talk about that?
Well, of course, on public record. He was the Archbishop, as you know, he's Archbishop of Melbourne, and he loved Melbourne. Melbourne is his town, you know. He's a member of the Melbourne Club, you know. This is his town. He knows every inch of it. His sources of information here are faultless. It's just wonderful. There's only one drawback with Melbourne, apart from traffic jams on a Thursday night. For him, the one drawback from Melbourne was that he couldn't be a cardinal if he stayed here. To be a cardinal, he had to go to Sydney. So he went to Sydney, and his first sort of 18 months in Sydney were just so wonderful. He'd left the child abuse scandals of Melbourne behind. He'd even shaken off the rainbow sash people. Poofters were leaving him alone. You know, nobody in fancy dress was trying to take communion. It was a wonderful time. And then he faced an accusation from a former altar boy who claimed that when he, Pell, was a seminarian supervising an altar boys' camp on Phillip Island in the early 1960s, that he had abused the kids there. Now, there was... The church hired a very distinguished retired judge, Alex Southall, to conduct a sort of private inquiry, and it was conducted privately as if it were a committal proceedings, really, because the accuser, who had taken a very long time to work out that the person he remembered as Big George was the man who was now Archbishop of Sydney. He claims to have suddenly seen him in purple on television one night and said, "That's Big George." He didn't want to go to the police. He, in fact, had a very long career as a professional criminal and had spent a lot of time in prison. There were no witnesses to support him. Pell's standing was untouched by the questioning, and the judge came to a decision which was obviously to say, you know, that the accusations aren't proven. But the judge also said that the accuser spoke as if speaking the truth. And he did not entirely dismiss the accusations, but did resoundingly say that the accusations were not established. The Sydney Morning Herald at that time wrote that it was a not quite complete exoneration. Pell has always said it is an exoneration. In my view, the charge did not stand against him.
Well, it certainly wasn't conclusive. What was presented at the end?
What was conclusive in the end was that the charge didn't stand. Yes.
Now, getting back to politicians and their view of George Pell and perhaps their reluctance to ever go further in inquiring into all these dreadful cases, is there, because we do know that Tony Abbott is a strong Catholic and he talks about this quite readily, is it possible that George Pell will have any influence in that regard?
There are people who believe we're in for some kind of Spanish Catholic dictatorship now that you know, Tony the Catholic is Prime Minister and his spiritual advisor is the Cardinal, and we'd all better head for the hills and, you know, dig out our rosaries and see what we can do to survive. It is fascinating that Tony Abbott's life was also shaped by being swept away by Bob Santamaria. You Melbourne people have a lot to answer for. You really do. Here, you know, the movement, Santamaria's movement, which essentially kind of appeared to drop dead in the 1970s when the last DLP senator, that DLP anyway, disappeared, is with us still. and it's a very important strand of Australian conservatism. It's risen unexpectedly to the top. Tony Abbott is essentially DLP in the Liberal Party, and that's a very strange fit, if it's a fit at all. For me, I think one of the most interesting things we're going to watch in the next couple of years is the extent to which Abbott can project his values in a party which is so unlike Abbott. But there was Pell doing all he could to stop the Royal Commission. In the days before Gillard called the Royal Commission, Pell wrote a column denouncing Royal Commissions. He preached against Royal Commissions in St Mary's Cathedral. He gave interviews against Royal Commissions. He did all he could to stop what was about to happen. But Tony Abbott, in the hours before Gillard announced the Royal Commission, put out a very fine statement saying, if the government is going to hold such an inquiry, we'll back it. So any kind of suggestion that Abbott is a puppet of Pell's, I think, is ridiculous. In the end, the secret of Tony Abbott is that for all of his Catholic past, for all of his Catholic values, for all of his Catholic loyalties, there's hardly anything that isn't negotiable. He's really a populist, pragmatic politician. And God knows he might have had a whiff that Nielsen poll was about to put public support for the Royal Commission at 95%. You'd be pretty lonely in that 5%. So I think the way we watch this work out is not in any kind of apocalyptic fears of the future. Abbott knows what you can't do in Australia with religion. He's not going to absolutely deny that one day he'd love to do something to end abortion, but he knows he can't for the moment. He knows he can't. And Pell's influence is strong, but it's not endless. It's not endless. And I'm not sure that that any of the churches, let alone the Catholic Church, are going to quite retain the privileges and the affection of the community that they have had as organisations, not as faiths, but as organisations, when the Royal Commission's done its work. I think we're going to be really shocked by what we discover.
And what do you think that Royal Commission is going to mean for George Pell?
Well, few of us are likely to outlive it. It's going to go on for a long time. I'm certainly going to be in retirement, well and truly. I'm going to be, I don't know, collecting rare Roman cameos or something to keep my mind alive. By the time it reports, it's going to be years. George Pell is 72 at the moment. He'll be Archbishop of Sydney at least until 75. I would suspect he has a longer career ahead of him than that. But I think that the Royal Commission is going to be devastating about all of the churches, including the Catholic Church. I think it's going to be devastating. And I don't, for instance, believe that the Catholic Church is going to be able to maintain the privilege of being unsuable once that Royal Commission is done. I just cannot believe that, even though this is a matter of a state-by-state, the states have got to fix this problem. Each individual state has got to fix this problem. It's fixed quite simply with simple legislation, which opens up the cash box of the Catholic Church to people that the Church has wounded and harmed. They're not willing to do it at the moment, but I can't in the end see the privilege surviving, that the organisation that has done the harm can also decide what to pay the victim. In our society, that's just not on.
An undercurrent through all of this is the question of celibacy. Do you think that is something that is now likely to get more attention?
Most priests want an end to celibacy, by the way. That's very clear. What's also clear is that it's the celibate church that has damaged the most children. Clearly, celibacy is not a precondition for paedophilia. Most pedophiles are married men. Most child abuse occurs within families. Most child abuse is domestic. Institutional child abuse, involving teachers and guardians and priests and the religious, is only part of the picture. And the Catholic Church is really the biggest church in Australia by any means these days, and it deals with more children than any other church. But nevertheless, Professor Patrick Parkinson, who's done a lot of consulting work, he's a professor at Sydney University, done a lot of consulting work for the Catholic Church on its towards healing protocols. He's finally left in disgust. He couldn't bear it any longer. But he has said that the Catholic Church has 6 times as many victims of abuse as all of the other faiths in Australia combined. Now the question is, if this is the celibate church, and celibacy is a farce. Look, celibacy can absolutely suit some priests, but it's been going for 8 or 9 centuries now. The church has decreed celibacy as a precondition of being a priest. For 8 or 9 centuries, that's essentially been a farce. Most priests we know have sexual relationships, and we know that because of very good work in the United States and also some very good work in Spain. I don't think similar work's been done in Australia, but most priests have sexual relationships. The Catholic Church has invested an enormous amount of its prestige in the insistence on celibacy. It doesn't work, and therefore for many centuries the Church has had to do 2 things. One, forgive priests for their multiple, continual and ludicrous breaches of celibacy. And they've forgiven priests an amazing amount, including, until recently, having sex with children. The drunkenness, the gambling, the adult sexual relationships, the criminal relationships with children have been forgiven for a very long time. And the other thing is that the Church has had to lie about this to the public and do absolutely all it can to maintain the facade of celibacy. And I think it is behind that facade of lies and spin that pedophiles just found the best safe haven our society could offer for a long time. Not anymore, but for a long time. And I think it was the delusions about celibacy and the lies about celibacy gave pedophiles a safe haven and access to children.
Through all of this, as these cases have emerged, and now we know, well, it may still be the tip of the iceberg, but we know that there are hundreds out there. You've said...
No, thousands.
Thousands.
Yeah.
You have said in the quarterly essay, whatever else he believes in, Pell has profound faith in the Catholic Church. He guards it with his life. Do you think that might be wavering even just a little bit, the more he hears about all of this?
Look, that's asking a question about the inner recesses of a man's mind. It does not seem so. And Tom Keneally told me this wonderful thing about Pell, a figure he knows quite well, and he said, you've got to think of Pell as one of those old comms who never got out of the party no matter how bad it got. Who stayed in after Hungary, who stayed in after Prague. And he talks about Pell as having a great holding the line personality. Pell believes that the Catholic Church is a great machine for good. If only Catholics would obey, if only they would put aside their consciences, if only they would stop taking the pill, if only Catholic men would stop fucking each other, if only the Pope was honoured and revered, this machine would work perfectly, and it would work for the infinite good of the world. And he is devoted to that machine and the possibilities of that machine. And I conclude the essay by saying, look, he gets it, He knows, as I was saying, he knows that the Church has behaved badly. He knows that lives have been ruined. But he is devoted to this machine, and he guards it with his life. And as he sees it, we'll be through this soon, and we can get on from here, and the Church will be once again that glorious institution which he knew from his childhood. And all this will be behind us.
I think that's a perfect point to open questions up to all of you now. We have microphones available if anybody has a question they would like to ask. Please feel free. Otherwise, I'm happy to keep on asking them. I think we have some coming.
We can't, of course, see your faces, so you can ask questions with the most perfect anonymity.
Do we have any questions? Yes, there's one.
You mentioned in your essay Pell being quite seduced by Oxford and the Vatican. To what extent do you think that's played out in his respect for institutions and hierarchy and pomp, I suppose?
It's absolutely, absolutely integral to him. Pell was plucked out of Werribee by Sir James O'Collins, the then infinitely ancient Bishop of Ballarat, to become an intellectual warrior on behalf of the Santa Maria forces inside the church. O'Collins was one of Santa Maria's most intimate supporters. And Pell went to Rome and he lapped it up, and God knows, in a way, how can you blame him? And I don't really. He was also in Rome during the Vatican II, and he was swept away by Vatican II as well. But at that stage, they didn't understand really what Vatican II was going to do to the church. We withdrew very quickly. In Oxford, it wasn't just the atmosphere of Oxford, which of course Tony Abbott also absolutely lapped up. But for Pell, it was a circle of very conservative philosophers who were very influential in his development as well. And he came back from Oxford and from Rome more conservative even than he had been when he set out. And yes, of course, devoted to these old, glamorous, surviving elite institutions, absolutely devoted to them. He loves them. He was a little bit out of water when he found himself returning from Oxford to be a curate in Swan Hill. But he knew he wasn't going to be there forever.
I think there's another question there.
Thank you. At one point you talked about Julia Gillard calling the Royal Commission, and you would explain how and why that occurred. I don't think I heard your response on that.
We could talk for about 4 hours on this one, and I'll try and keep it to about 10 lines. I say in the essay, it is very, very difficult to actually chart the way in which fundamental shifts in community understanding on big issues of this kind happen. I use the metaphor of a house. One day it's standing there, and sure, there's a crack here and there and the floor's sagging, but the next day it just collapses. And what collapsed really was the notion that you could leave it to the churches. And that collapsed over about 15 or 20 years and reached a climax that was brought on by about 4 things. The first, of course, was Baillieu having the courage, partial courage, in Victoria to set up a parliamentary inquiry, not a royal commission, which I think would perhaps have worked better, but parliamentary inquiry, which I suspect is going to work pretty well anyway. He set it up. Then there was a devastating submission from the police, which said that the Melbourne response had never once referred a single victim or a single case to them for investigation. That hit like a bomb. And then up in New South Wales, a police detective inspector in Newcastle, up in the Hunter area, wrote an astonishing public letter to the Premier, Barry O'Farrell, accusing his own colleagues of working with the church in order to block investigations of widespread pedophile abuse by priests in the Newcastle area. And these things just came together, bang, bang, bang. And in particular, that letter, its timing and And then Farrell called a little inquiry. He said he was going to call a little inquiry. There was a public uproar that this was not enough, that something better had to be done, and Gillard moved. That was the course of it. And by this time, Pell had lost his capacity to stop it. He couldn't stop it anymore, and it just swept over him. And he had to hold that terrible press conference, which is the opening section of the essay, that terrible press conference to welcome the Royal Commission.
Do we have any other questions there? Yes?
David, I'm interested in the gender fallout of the child abuse. Is it a perverse sort of statement about the Catholic Church's attitude to women that this has come out when the issues seem to be very strongly associated with the abuse of male children? Is there a silence about the abuse of girls still sitting there?
Not that I know of at all. And one of the reasons I became so bleakly interested in this subject was that I was following the criminal prosecutions of some priests in New South Wales, and this was a not untypical career at all. This priest was working in a boarding school where he was abusing children. His order must have got wind of it somehow or other, and he was pulled out of the boarding school and brought down to a parish in Sydney. There he abused little girls, and he then appeared to have been rehabilitated, and he was sent back to the boarding school where he resumed abusing little boys. I don't think that I have not detected any notion that somehow or other the abuse of boys is more terrible than the abuse of girls. I've not detected that at all. I think that because priests and brothers working in boys' schools had access to, boys, that for a lot of the time you hear about, boys as victims. But, the Fosters, and their book, by the way, Hell on the Way to Heaven, is a beautiful book. And a grim subject, but it is so calmly and beautifully and wisely written. It's a terrific book. 2 daughters, both daughters raped by this priest. O'Donnell, the priest, was known by the police as a 2-a-day man.
And one of those daughters suicided, of course.
One of those daughters suicided, yes. And the sex of the child was a matter of complete indifference to people like Ridsdale and O'Donnell. Complete indifference.
The question?
Given this man's trajectory thus far, I'm sure, I have this theory, that with the last papal election, he really expected to be made Pope. And he's now, my feeling about the man is that he's reached his peak, he didn't quite make it to the crown, and now there's going to be a slow decline into depression and dementia. What do you think?
No. He did not expect to be Pope. He said something really wonderful when he was interviewed on his departure from Sydney Airport going over to the conclave. He said, "I'll be returning." There's no doubt that the present Pope is a very different kind of man to the previous 2. The sort of bishop that Pell was just the kind of bishop that John Paul II wanted. They were absolutely perfect. And Pell was a protégé of John Paul II's. He was a friend of Benedict's because they'd worked together in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. But curiously, Pell is one of those people, and I talk about this in the essay, is one of those princes of the church who is always being tipped as the next, something, the next sort of great office in the church. And I quote a very funny religious journalist who says, if Pell had actually got every post that he was tipped for, he'd be running everything in the Vatican. there's a new pope. They're very different men. Nevertheless, this pope has appointed him to this group, the G8, which is meeting at the moment. And I'm sure many of us in this room saw in The Age this morning the exquisite photograph of Pell in that Renaissance corridor, dressed in black with his red sash, being saluted by a Swiss guard. Now, I'd go into it for that. I mean, yes, certain sacrifices, but imagine it. Just imagine it. Heaven. Heaven.
I cannot see this. Do we have any other questions out there?
A forest of hands.
Most of the discussions centred around priests, and the only, in terms of brothers, the only case I've heard of is St John of God in Victoria, where it was concerned with the abuse of disabled men. Is sex abuse as widespread amongst the brothers? And if it isn't, is there any reasons you can identify for that being the case?
Look, the figures may at some point emerge, but I've always, I mean, these stories, it's brothers and priests. You know, there's no sense that the Marrists, the Christians, the Vincentians, the John of God. I mean, there are unfortunately pedophiles through all of it.
And St John of God actually did make quite a lengthy appearance at the Victorian inquiry.
And the proportion of pedophiles amongst the brothers of St John of God was astonishing.
Mm.
He says, querulous, sounding like my own great aunt. But it was a very, very high figure. It was amazingly high. And the question was asked of them, didn't you ever investigate this? Didn't you ever try to find out how many pedophiles there were in the ranks? Didn't you ever ask questions about why this might be happening? No.
I found that the most telling. That was just a consistent theme, wasn't it? Whoever appeared.
Didn't you inquire? No.
Next question.
Hi, it seems to me telling that the Royal Commission was called by a Prime Minister who was a non-believer. Do you think it could have happened with anyone else?
No, I think that was important. That she is a non-believer actually weakened her in some respects when it came to social policy and social legislation. I mean, she fell in with this nonsense that, you know, you can't have... The church has a right not to employ homosexual surgeons in its hospitals. She fell in with that crap. But on this, she was very firm. And I think the fact that she is not a believer, counted. She had, of course, a religious upbringing. She's a Baptist, or she was a Baptist, and she knows all the hymns off by heart, let me tell you. And I think she has a very clear idea of how the religious should behave. She said, as she left her press conference, at the press conference, at her final press conference, on the night that she'd lost the vote in caucus, she listed the Royal Commission as one of the achievements of her time as Prime Minister. This wasn't much reported by my colleagues, but it was there on the list, and she said, and I quote in the essay, "This will change the nation." I think she could be right.
I think we've got time for maybe one more question.
G'day, David. Eureka Street has published a commentary on your essay.
Yes.
By a Catholic priest, by a Jesuit, and he classifies your essay as being unfair. He says that you were more like a prosecutor for the prosecution in the way that you've treated George Pell, and that while you sifted through things very much to break down anything that appeared as favourable. People who made criticisms weren't dealt with so categorically. I don't know whether you've read the article.
I have, yes.
Yes, but I'd like you to comment, and I mean, you probably are as aware as well as I am of the reservations that person has set out about your essay.
Yep. Look, he has a different view of Pell, and that's fine. It's a beautifully written critique. I disagree with everything that you've mentioned. I don't believe it is a prosecution brief. I think it's a fair judgment. I think it's understated rather than overstated. I have sifted out of it an enormous number of accusations against Pell, which I do not believe are fair or well-based. They are simply not in the essay. Now look, he has a different view of Pell, and I've written an essay that's my view of Pell, and I think it's terrific that Eureka Street has written and said, boom, this is not our view. That's fine. I urge people to read it. And I say it's beautifully written, but I just disagree with it.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for coming. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to all of your questions, but I hope it's been an informative experience for you, and we'll see you another time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.